Hello, everybody. Very excited to have my next guest on the show. And he knows a thing or two about how the criminal justice system works for over 30 years. He's A.X.Foster. He's prosecuted and defended complex homicide trials for over 30 years. And he lives in the D.C. area, Washington, D.C. area. And he's here to talk about his book, which he's going to tell you about. A.X., thanks for being on the show, sir.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, you have, we were talking a little bit before we started. I can't imagine, AX, the amount, just the trials you could talk about. And I know you kind of cover some of this in your book, which we're going to talk about. But what got you from a young age? What made you want to be an attorney?
Well, it's really a circuitous story. I went to college to be an actor, and what I wanted to be was a great Shakespearean actor on the stage in New York City. And I was a professional actor for 7 years. I appeared on soap operas, TV commercials, all kinds of things. But I was frustrated with that life, and I decided to go to law school so I could become an agent for actors and athletes and artists. So I went to law school to major in sports and entertainment law. Okay, when I got to law school, I fell in love with criminal law, and we had to do moot court, everyone, and I loved it. It's like acting in a little legal drama. So I fell in love with the process. I took an internship at the Cobb County, Georgia DA's office. And I did my first jury trial when I was actually a law student. And then it was game over for me. I really loved the process of being a prosecutor, the competition. I'm highly competitive, helping people, putting somebody's life back in order after they've been victimized, and also putting a dangerous person in jail. Those things all appealed to me. And I ended up being a prosecutor for 20 years. I wasn't expecting that, but that's the path I ended up taking.
Well, obviously you're very good at it, or you wouldn't have been in that position for over 2 decades. Now, my dad was an attorney. He was a lawyer for many years. He's since passed, but I remember him telling me that law school is hard for some, but not as hard for others. How was your experience? What was your take? Was it difficult for you, or was it just kind of?
I thought I was terrified the first week because I was older. As I said, I took 7 years off between college and law school. So I didn't even start law school until I was 29, 30 years old. And there were all these very smart, younger people whose parents were lawyers like you, and they knew what was happening. And I was just this guy from New York City who went down to Atlanta. And I felt like, man, I may not be able to make it, but it's kind of a boot camp mentality. And I remember the first time I was called on in class to stand up and tell the group about the case assignment we had read the previous night. And I was relaxed, I was funny, I was good on my feet. And I finally felt like, no, there's some skill that I have that maybe these younger people don't have, who are terrified of public speaking.
Yeah.
So my acting experience really came in handy, not in terms of acting a character, but in terms of being aware of your environment, presentation skills, oration, and arguing in a clever way. I don't mean arguing like hostility, but like legally arguing. I felt I had a knack for that. And then I felt more confident. And then once we did this moot court thing, I really felt like now I'm on my home turf. I know how to play characters, to role play. Because when you do the moot court tournament, one day you're the prosecutor, the next day you're the defense attorney, and you keep switching. And you're in a tournament, and I finished first in my law school tournament out of 300 competitors. So that was the big accomplishment that I was really proud of. And then I got a job as a prosecutor. And as I say, I stayed there for 20 years.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it makes sense. I mean, your experience in acting and commercials and other thing you did in stuff in film would prepare you for being in front of people. That's one of the number one fears out there, AX, people getting in front of people and actually having to perform whatever that may look like, speak or whatever. But you're correct. And obviously, this. I mean, the trial process is adversarial. So, and the listeners probably know that too, where it's this side against that side. What are some of the more difficult cases that you've dealt with over your career? I mean, homicide cases, and they're all difficult, obviously. They're all victims and involved in each case. But can you talk about one or two of some of the most difficult trials you saw?
Sure. I've done over 100 jury trials,
Wow.
which is a lot. That's quite a resume. Mostly I did violent crimes. I specialized in child abuse cases for several years, and those are some of the most difficult you can do, particularly if you have a child who is a witness. Now, the book that I wrote, it's a novel, it's fiction.
Mm-hmm.
It's a legal thriller called Gavel to Gavel. And the story in Gavel to Gavel is based on a bunch of different murder trials that I actually did. And I kind of weave them together into a story. And the reader takes the position of a juror. And the reader sees both sides. And by the end of the book, has to make a decision whether they believe that the defendant is guilty or not guilty. But in my book, I feature a 9-year-old girl who is the eyewitness to a murder. And not only is she young, but she has disabilities.
Oh, wow.
So that's a challenge for a prosecutor, to have your whole case sort of hanging in the balance on the testimony of a disabled child. That's the dramatic,
wow,
exciting incident that starts my story off.
Wow. And it reminds me, I think when you talk about you could be the juror in this book, it reminds me, I don't know why, but 12 Angry Men popped into the film, from years ago, 12 Angry Men, where they get this, trial, and it's all from the perspective of the jury.
Absolutely. I love that movie, particularly the original with Henry Fonda.
Absolutely.
And they're in, they've changed that because to make it not so misogynistic, 12 Angry People, because our jurors are women and ethnicity and diversity. We're not just 12 angry white men on the jury anymore. But that's a movie from, I think, the 1950s. But I love that movie and watched it as a boy many times. And it did get me interested in doing a jury trial. And my book kind of borrows a little of that theme, where the reader becomes a juror. And they're like, well, the evidence is good, but no, the cross-examination was good. And I try to balance it out so it's a close call. And then when you get to the end of the book, you're not quite sure, is this person going to be guilty or not guilty?
Yeah.
So that's really the structure of my book, of my series. I've just finished writing the second book in what is the Seneca County Courthouse series. I just sent my second book off to the publisher to start that long process. But my second book is called Double Blind. And it's about a drug dealer who is murdered, and all the problems dealing with corruption, corrupt police. I know you were a police officer once, and even a corrupt judge. And I think it's a very interesting sequel to the first book. It's a series. The prosecutor, Mac McIntyre, is the center character, and then he has a new case in each book.
Yeah. And as a prosecutor, AX, I mean, I'm sure you've seen, and you can't tell, I mean, corruption, in public service over the years to some degree. I mean, I think of Serpico and the Knapp Commission and all that stuff that came out of, that case. I mean, I like to think that, while I do believe there are some corrupt police officers out there, I'd like to think the vast majority of them, do a good job and they're honest and fair. But being a prosecutor, you had to have that. Every prosecutor has to have a good relationship with law enforcement, correct? I mean, they're the ones putting the cases, giving them to you, and you're deciding whether or not you're gonna go for it or not.
Yes, I've worked with hundreds of police officers. In fact, I married a police officer. So I know what the cop mentality is like, even though I've never been a cop. I've done a lot of ride-alongs, but being a prosecutor is, some people say, oh, you're just a police lawyer, but you have to be neutral. I mean, I've been to autopsies, I've been to many crime scenes. I often tell people I'm probably the guy who's seen more dead bodies than anyone at this whole party.
Absolutely.
Unless you're like a soldier or something. But yeah, most of the cops, in my personal experience, are good people who do the right thing, who are honest. But I've also seen some bad cops too. And one thing that has changed in the course of my career, and in yours too, is the use of body cam footage. And now we can see what's happening. And you have these landmark cases like George Floyd and like the cops who beat the guy to death in Memphis. And I mean, you just think back to your own experiences. I've seen some things on ride-alongs that, if they were captured on video, would be very bad for the officer in terms of IAD or internal affairs, etc. But having said that, in any group of people, you'll have good ones and bad ones.
Yeah.
All your listeners, whatever they do, doctor, lawyer, plumber, restaurant, you'll have good people and you'll have bad mixed together. It's no different in the police department or on the judiciary or in the prosecutor's office. I've seen some really, unethical prosecutors in my time who would cheat or bend the rules. And that is also a theme in my book. The prosecutor in my book, Mac McIntyre, discovers evidence halfway through the trial that's going to blow his case apart. He legally, as you know, has an obligation to turn that over. Is he going to, or is he going to win his case? That's one of the
now I got to get your book.
That's one of the themes in my book. Gavel to gavel.
Yeah, and you made a good point, A.X.
Get this book.
That's going to be linked up. Everybody who's listening and watching this later on in YouTube, that's going to be linked up in the show notes where you can pick up A.X.'s book. And you made a really good point about, a lot of people out there don't realize that prosecutors, I mean, I know this, that they'll go to autopsies, they'll go to crime scenes. They will obviously work closely with the police officers. In terms of crime scenes, they have to go to the crime scenes, especially big ones, or they should, because they're going to be the ones prosecuting the case. So they have to get a sense of what the crime scene looks like, as well as autopsies. And like you mentioned, but a lot of people don't realize how much work goes into prosecuting a case. It's not like, TV shows where you get on there for, an hour and that's just entertainment, but prosecutors do a tremendous job, as does the defense.
Well, I agree. The way our office was, this is back in the day of pagers that even predates cell phones. If my pager went off at 4 a.m, I knew somebody had just gotten killed and I was being called to a crime scene. It's important for the cops or investigators at a crime scene to have some guidance with legal issues. There might be search and seizure. There might be someone in custody who needs to be advised of his or her Miranda rights. There might be forensic things, like maybe you bring in luminol to test for blood, or collection of fingerprints, blood stains, ballistics, what have you. DNA, I did one of the first DNA cases around here going back to 1989. And I also did the first cold case DNA in Maryland. And that's now very commonplace. Yeah. Now they're using genealogical charts to trace family connections. But a prosecutor I would go to the crime scene, and then you see the dead body, but then you also get all the clues.
Absolutely.
What do I see? What does this space look like? Because you have to recreate that for the jury. And unless you know what it looks like, smells like, sounds like, I don't think you can bring it back to life adequately months later when you're in a cold courtroom.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's another thing that people don't know, and I'm sure the listeners, a lot of them know, is this stuff could take a year to go to trial. I mean, it doesn't happen overnight. But some of the issues that I always ran into as a young detective and a young patrol officer were Fourth Amendment issues and chain of custody issues in big cases. Fourth Amendment, like you mentioned, AX, search and seizure, detainment, of course, Miranda, Sixth Amendment, Fifth Amendment. But those are some of the issues that I would initially get hammered on. What was the problem?
Yeah, well,
did you have PC to search?
All cops have to go through an academy where they get a quick training on these things, but I think they learn over the course of their career. In my book, there's a confession that is suppressed in the early part of the book because the police detective did not advise the suspect properly. My book is not so much a whodunit because in the beginning, it's the little girl's mother who kills the father, but it's a why done it. It's all good. The whole book goes to the issue of intent.
Yeah.
Was she justified in killing this man because he was abusive, or was she killing him to gain something like an inheritance?
Yeah.
So in my book, I make it a little bit harder for the prosecutor to prove because the woman confesses, but then that confession is suppressed and the jury will never hear that. That's just a dramatic device to kind of even out the case and make it more risky for the prosecutor to take it to trial. But you have those issues. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, but like in your book, Gavel to Gavel, I mean, those issues are not, uncommon where a confession gets suppressed because usually there's there's usually a custody issue where the officer's not, they're getting interrogated and you're in custody and they're not getting Mirandized.
Yeah, I mean, Fifth Amendment Miranda, everyone knows just from watching TV, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can be used against you. You have the right to a lawyer. If you can't afford one will be appointed by the court. That is case law stemming from the early 1960s, a Florida case involving a guy who didn't have a lawyer.
Escobedo.
It changed the way it changed the way that we operate in court. But, if your listeners should know, you are not obligated to talk to a police officer. You can always decline politely and ask for representation. But Miranda only applies these rights only apply if two things are happening. Custodial interrogation. And what does that mean? Well, if you're on the phone, we're doing a Zoom call. I'm not in custody, and you're a police officer. I'm not in custody. So anything I say doesn't need to be Mirandized.
Absolutely.
So custody, you're in handcuffs. You're in an interview room. You're not free to leave. And then interrogation is the questioning.
Yeah.
Sometimes someone will be in custody and they'll blurt out, "Oh my God, why did I kill her?" That's not in response to any interrogation or questioning. So Miranda doesn't apply. So there are rules. Each state is different. There are general rules, but there are lots of exceptions to them as well.
Yeah.
So anyone out there who gets a call from a cop, it would be good advice for you to call counsel before lots of people think I'll go in and explain my side of the story. That's a very bad idea.
I agree. I've seen that happen a lot. And then we end up getting, obviously more PC'd or probable cause to make an arrest. But it's amazing to me, AX, how many cops, and there are, at least when I was a cop, there were quite a few that didn't realize that you had to have two things present: custody and interrogation, custodial interrogation, before Miranda applied. I remember arresting a lot of people, and sometimes I wouldn't Mirandize them because they weren't in custody. I'm just talking to them, and got enough PC. We're doing an investigation,
Right.
and they're telling me stuff, and then okay, now there's enough PC. Turn around, put your hands behind your back. Now, if I wanted to talk to them, as you know, and the listeners know, once they're in custody, then Miranda would apply.
Right. But you know what? When I was a prosecutor, we actually coached and taught our top detectives how to create non-custodial environments. For example, if you're not in a uniform, you're not wearing a weapon, a service weapon, and you say, come on in, you have a friendly interview
Absolutely.
room, not some obvious like dungeon. And you say, look, buddy, you're free to go. You're not in custody. You can leave anytime you want. I just want to talk to you about what happened. Hey, you don't need Miranda for that because it's not a custodial setting.
Absolutely.
So sometimes our cops, the good ones here, would actually create a non-custodial environment, because once people hear Miranda, they're like, oh wow, maybe I need a lawyer. Let's stop.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Once you advise them of their rights, your interview's over.
Yeah, psychologically, something happens with people, and they're going, "Oh shit, I'm in trouble." But you're right. I mean, you're the expert, but I remember getting cross-examined about, okay, how many officers were present? Where did you, and talking about possible custody, where did you respond with your lights on? Was your car parked in front of the house? Those could all be custody issues if somebody didn't feel like they could leave, free to leave in their own home. And people are
absolutely right. A lot of people think, oh, well, I wasn't in handcuffs, so I wasn't in custody. No, custody just means your freedom of movement is curtailed. If you're in a locked room, you can't get out. Or if the cop says, or you say to the police officer, can I leave? And the officer says, no, we're not done yet. You're in custody.
Or sit in the back of the patrol car, and I'll get with you in a minute. I'm going to close the door.
I can't open it now.
I can't open it. But getting back to the book, AX, I mean, well, first of all, what compelled you to start writing?
Okay.
Go ahead.
All right. Well, I've always been interested in writing and reading. And even going back to when I was a boy and I read all the Hardy Boys, and then I read my sister's Nancy Drew's. I've always, John Grisham, Scott Turow, Agatha Christie, those kinds of books always have been my favorites. And, I was busy all this time with law school and a very busy career. But when COVID hit around 2020, they shut the courthouse down here for a long time. And I figured I might as well write that manuscript that I've always had in the back of my mind. And I wrote like a 300-page manuscript and sent it out, and people reacted very positively to it and said, you have the authority to write this book because it's based on your real experiences.
Absolutely.
And then I got a lot of, it took 3 years for it to go from start to finish, because the publishing industry was something I was unfamiliar with, and agents and publishing and rewriting and formatting and proofreading, and it took forever. But the end result made it all worth it, because I have a really good book out there. It's up on Amazon. It's doing really well. I mean, I had over 3,000 downloads in one day when we released it. People like legal thrillers. They like courtroom stories. I mean, there are whole TV networks like Court TV that are devoted to showing trials. And there's always some crazy trial in America. You had the South Carolina case, Murdoch, where the guy killed his wife and son.
Oh, yeah.
That was such a freak show. And then we're getting ready to start this case in Idaho with the guy that went in and killed the 4 college kids. And then you've got Trump. And I mean, Johnny Depp and Amber Heard. In America, there's always something. So I tried to tap into that. You know, Law and Order TV show, very popular.
Yeah.
My book is similar to all of those things. And people like a good courtroom story. From Perry Mason to John Grisham.
Well,
and so on.
Well, and especially from a guy like yourself that has decades of trial experience and prosecutor experience. Like you said, it lends more credibility as some regular writer up there, doing some research and putting it together. Of course, you lived it, you breathed it for decades. And I can't imagine you probably got enough material to write 20 books, maybe more, maybe more.
Well, I just finished my second, and I've got a really good idea for my third. But, that's all I can write about. I mean, if I wrote a book about astronauts going to Mars, it would sound very inauthentic because I don't really know anything about that. I could research it, but I haven't lived it.
Yeah, exactly.
And a lot of people who write legal thrillers, I mean, some of them are lawyers, and some of them are journalists who have researched it. But I'm a prosecutor and a defense attorney, and I bring that to this book. And I think my readers, the comments on my Amazon page, all talk about how realistic it is. Because I do cross-examination, I pick a jury, I do motions, I do the kind of stuff that really happens.
Absolutely.
And I take a case from start to finish, from gavel to gavel.
Yeah.
All the way from the crime, the night it's committed, all the way to the jury verdict.
Absolutely.
So, I really tried hard to make it based on what I know is right. And I hope I've done that. I really have tried hard to do that.
Well, I can't wait to read it. I'm going to pick it up. And I love the name, by the way, A.X. I mean, gavel to gavel. I think that is so cool. Now, what advice would you give to any aspiring writers out there? You mentioned a little bit, the publishing process and stuff like that. I mean, what advice would you give to a possible writer out there? Because I think most people have a book in them at some point.
Well, I mean, the first big sort of fork in the road is fiction versus nonfiction.
Absolutely.
I mean, I could have written my memoirs about all the big cases I did. But outside of my family, I don't think too many people would have been interested. But fiction allows me to create. And as I said, I started out as an actor on the stage. So I have a foundation in the creative arts. And some of my book reads like a play because it's a lot of dialogue, it's cross-examination. And I think I have a good ear for the way people sound and characters.
Yeah.
I have a judge, I have a defense attorney, the prosecutor. So a lot of what I write as fiction is based on courtroom experience, but it's also based on theater and drama and understanding what keeps the story moving.
Absolutely.
So I would say, as advice to your listeners who think they have a book in them, write what you know. Don't write about going to the moon. Write about what you know. And it doesn't have to be a career. It could be something that you've experienced in your family, a life or a death. A best friend of mine who's writing a book, he just wrote a novel about a 12-year-old boy who goes horseback riding and the horse falls down and breaks its leg and has to be destroyed, and how that affected him, post-traumatic stress and some other things. So you don't have to be a courtroom lawyer to have something that's interesting.
Yeah.
And that's what you can write about.
Absolutely. Now, you made a comment really quick, A.X., about you were a prosecutor for so many years, and now you're a defense attorney. We had to talk about this before we started. I mean, that's the track. A lot of prosecutors end up starting their own practice and going to defense, correct?
Yes, but what makes sort of my path a little different is I stayed as a prosecutor for 20 years.
Absolutely.
When you're in law school and you want to be a courtroom lawyer, there really are only two paths to getting that fast experience. One is to be a prosecutor, The other is to be a public defender. And in my book, I have a public defender represent the client. But because then you're doing trials, you're doing courtroom day after day after day. And 2 years as a prosecutor is like 10 years in a law firm where you never really go to trial. So to get that, I mean, I did 16 jury trials in 1 year when I was a young man. That's more than one a month.
Oh my God.
There's nowhere else you're going to get that experience. And the more you do these cases, you start to feel more comfortable. You start to see patterns emerge. And when you're a beginning prosecutor and you're in traffic court, your first stop up the rungs of the ladder, I mean, you do 8 drunk driving trials in front of a judge every week. I mean, after a month, you've done 25 bench trials. So the learning curve is very, very steep and you learn fast.
Yeah.
So yeah, those are really the best ways to get courtroom experience. Public defender or prosecutor.
Absolutely. Now, being a defense attorney, you know all the tricks the prosecutor's going to try to throw at you and say, well, no. I've been down that road. I did this for a long time.
Well, I like to use this analogy, Pat. It's like you played chess with the white pieces for 20 years, and now you turn the board around and you play with the black pieces.
I like that.
It's the same game, but you're looking at it from a different perspective. One thing I would say beyond just the gamesmanship, which you do learn, it's the personal contacts you make.
Absolutely.
I mean, I can call up the prosecutor's office and talk to my old colleagues on a first name basis, and I get a little home cooking. Or the judges, I mean, they wanted me to run for judge 15 years ago. Most of the judges where I practice law are people I was a prosecutor with or a friend.
Yeah.
So when I walk in a courtroom, you know, I'm going to get a little edge if it comes down to credibility, because these people know me. They know I'm a straight shooter. I'm not going to lie or cheat or play. And when I say, Judge, this is inadmissible, read this case, they're thinking that's probably right, because he's not a kind of guy that's going to BS us in a courtrourtroom. So if your listeners ever get in trouble, and I hope they never do, but stuff happens. When you're looking for a lawyer, look at who the former prosecutors are, because I agree with you. I think they definitely have an edge on someone who's just been a defense attorney their whole career.
And I love it that you, even though it's fiction, you took your experience, you made it into this legal thriller, Gavel to Gavel, which is going to be, for the listeners, going to be linked up in the show notes. A.X.Foster, any final thoughts before we wrap up, sir?
Hey, it's been great talking to you. I really appreciate your inside knowledge on the law and law enforcement. We're speaking the same language. I hope your listeners will take a stab at Gavel to Gavel.
Absolutely. Just
Google me. It's A.X.Foster. I'm the only one out there, and it'll pop you right up to my website, A.X.Foster.com. And it's been great talking to you, and hopefully I'll come back on when my second book comes out.
Absolutely, sir. And it's a pleasure and honor having you on, sir. And thank you for your years of service in the prosecutor's office. And for the listener, like I said, everything's going to be linked up in the show notes. Thank you, AX, and I hope to have you back on soon.
Thank you very much. Take care.